Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the rest of the 2024 NHL entry draft for the San Jose Sharks. It was a very exciting day for the organization yesterday, as for the first time in franchise history, they had the first overall selection in a draft. They use it to pick up centerman Macklin Celebrini, but they also had the 11th overall pick to pick up a strong defensive prospect in Sam Dickinson. So it was a very successful first round of the draft, but they still had 7 picks remaining on day 2 for rounds 2 to 7, and they started off immediately with the 33rd overall pick. I had made a video discussing who the Sharks could select with this second rounder because of the fact that even though it is technically in the second round, it is immediately after the first round concludes, and so you are likely to end up with a first-round caliber player who had snuck through the cracks in those first 32 picks. And that's indeed the case for San Jose. I know a lot of Sharks fans were hoping they'd go with defenseman Dominik Bedinka with this selection. In fact, Bedinka would end up getting drafted immediately after at 34th overall because of the fact that he is a defenseman, which the Sharks do need, and he is a right-handed defenseman, which the Sharks desperately need. But instead, Mike Grier decides to take a best player available approach here and pick up Igor Chernyshov instead. This was a player who was expected at the very least to go in the first round, perhaps even as high as the teens in that first round, but instead fell all the way down to 33 for the Sharks to be able to snatch up, and this was very lucky for San Jose. This is a player who has a lot of very good talent, fits the prototypical Mike Grier mold that he absolutely loves. A 6'2" power forward type of player, but who's not just lumbering around the ice unable to make plays, but actually has really good hands, smooth skating, and is not afraid to get into the board battles to make things happen. Kind of in a Timo Meier type of mold, which was a player who the Sharks got to enjoy for many years before being traded to the New Jersey Devils. He has been playing in the MHL this past season for a decent chunk of it before making the jump to the KHL, where he didn't necessarily have a ton of offensive success, just 4 points in the over 30 games he played there, which could have perhaps contributed to why he ended up falling just barely outside of the first round. But it should of course be noted that outside of the NHL, the KHL is the most competitive men's league in the entire world for hockey, and so it is very difficult for a player who hasn't even been drafted yet at just 18 years of age to actually find good success at that level. But what it does do is give him a lot of really competitive experience, which a lot of these NHL prospects usually don't manage to get. Playing in the OHL, the WHL, these are great development leagues, but it is always a big wake-up call when those players eventually make the jump to the AHL and then the NHL. But for someone like Chernyshov, who will have this time in the KHL, good learning opportunities playing against some really good players in that particular league, this is going to allow him to make that jump to the NHL much easier and much more comfortable for him. Now, he is still under KHL contract, so he will remain in Russia going into next season, but in a couple of years, when he hopefully makes the transition to North America, could he be a factor on the Sharks' main NHL squad? It certainly depends on how his development goes this next season, but there is a possibility of that being the case. He is relatively NHL ready. Then we move on to the 53rd overall selection. This was the pick that the Sharks got for free, essentially, in the Jake Wallman trade with the Detroit Red Wings, and they use it to pick up a defenseman, left-handed, unfortunately enough, but one who does have some skill, Leo Salin Wallenius. Now, he is actually the one player outside of Celebrini, technically, on this list who doesn't necessarily fit the Mike Grier mold. When I was discussing the Sam Dickinson selection yesterday, I mentioned how the decision came down to between Dickinson and Buyam, and perhaps one of the deal breakers was that Dickinson is 6'3", which is pretty good for an NHL defenseman, while Buyam stands at just 6 foot, which is relatively average and somewhat even viewed as a bit undersized. Wallenius is also 6 foot, which is relatively undersized, like I said, for an NHL defenseman, but where he may lack in that area, he makes up for from offensive capabilities. While he doesn't necessarily have the super high-end talent like the early first rounders of Carter Yakimchuk and Zane Parik, he is one of the more offensive skilled defenseman in the draft this year, was expected to go in the early parts of the second round. Strong numbers in the junior leagues in Sweden. We know the San Jose Sharks have been very, very comfortable drafting players from Sweden over these last couple of years. They have a ton of trust in their Swedish scouting staff, and so it is no surprise that they end up going with that here at 53rd overall with Wallenius. And while he does need a bit of work defensively for sure, he is the type of player who in 3 to 4 years time could end up being a solid second pair pairing guy for the San Jose Sharks who brings a bit of a power play specialty as well. Some really, really good numbers, and 6 foot, while it's not necessarily great, is not that undersized either, so it shouldn't be that difficult of a transition to the NHL either. Then we move on to 82nd overall, where we get to the Sharks' next pick here in the 3rd round, Carson Wetsch. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly and not butchering like I might with a lot of these prospects on the list. One notable fact, I guess, is that he did play a lot of his youth hockey with Macklin Celebrini. I don't know if that made much of an impact in him being drafted, but it is something to note. Like I said, fits into a Mike Greer type of mold to a T. 6'2", strong power forward coming out of the WHL. Has some offensive talent, not necessarily a game breaker at that particular area, but can put the puck in the net on a pretty bad Calgary Hitman team this past season. He's going to be able to step into a bigger role for his WHL squad next year, and we shall see if he manages to take steps forward developmentally offensively in that area. But one thing that he does need to improve on is his defensive play. I would say he's not necessarily projected to be able to make a huge impact in an NHL top 6 in the future, more of a middle 6 at best, with a bottom 6 being more so his target. And if you're going to play in that particular area of an NHL lineup, you do need to be more defensively responsible. So that's definitely something to work on as well. As we know, as you move later and later on into the draft, you get the players who have more raw talent, who will need multiple years of development to actually be able to have any sort of chance of making it to the NHL. And you're kind of just hoping that those players, and with their raw talent, can manage to put that together and become decent NHL players for yourself. But there are very, very far from any guarantees at this point. Then we move on to 116th overall in the draft, where the Sharks actually take a swing at a goaltender. You know, the Sharks' forward prospect pool is really good, especially with the addition of Macklin Celebrini, and the defensive prospect pool saw some notable improvement here with this draft with the addition of Sam Dickinson, but it is the goaltending prospect pool for San Jose that is very, very shallow. There isn't necessarily one player who stands out above the rest as a potential future starter for the organization, but as we know, goaltenders are notoriously difficult to predict. Around every single league in the league, every single junior league, I should say, around the world, players are first and foremost trying to score points. That is the heavy emphasis that is put on, because you're trying to get noticed by these scouting staffs and everything like that, and the best way to do so is by scoring goals and getting points. And because of that, the defensive game can be neglected somewhat, which means certain goaltenders, especially on teams that are lower ranked in their respective leagues, can be hung out to dry very significantly. And so a lot of these goaltenders will have stats that suffer while they're not actually all that terrible. And so you do need to be able to take a look at how a goaltender fundamentally plays the game to really be able to understand their NHL potential, which is much more difficult than just looking at a stat sheet, which means goaltending is much more of a coin flip to actually be able to predict. So here at 116th, the Sharks, like I said, taking a big swing here with Christian Kirsch. He was, notably enough, the Sharks' #1 goaltender on their draft board, at least according to the San Jose Sharks themselves. So they at least got the guy that they really wanted. He stands at 6'4", which is quite good for an NHL goalie. Goalies have been trending upwards in terms of height, as it's just a natural advantage to be able to cover more of the net due to that aspect of someone, so that is a good thing for them. But like I said, it's difficult to really evaluate what he might bring, and it also takes a while for goaltenders to develop. This is a type of player who we probably won't expect to make any sort of impact within the next 2-3 years, and we're perhaps looking more so like 5 years down the line to see if he ever actually makes any sort of jump to the even close to NHL level. Then we get to 131st overall, where the Sharks pick up Colton Roberts. Finally, a dream here, a right-handed defenseman. As I said, lefties all the way down for the San Jose Sharks pretty much, but they finally get a right-handed guy, but it is in the early parts of the 5th round, so there isn't necessarily a ton of hope, but he does have some decent tools for himself. First of all, 6'4", no surprise there. Big, hulking defenseman picked up by Mike Greer. His offensive game does leave a lot to be desired, but has shown some improvement from his previous draft -1 year, which is nice to see. Defensively, he does some decent things, but we will need a bit of improvement for that. But he could perhaps become a decent bottom pairing defenseman. There are a lot of strong tools here, and there were times this season where he was viewed as more of a potential late 3rd rounder in the NHL. So he's someone who is definitely worth taking a flyer on in the 5th. Then we get to the 143rd overall pick. We have Nate Miskey here. The most notable thing about Miskey is that he is an overager in this draft. His original draft year was last season, 2023, so he gets picked in 2024, the year after, but he showed some massive steps forward developmentally, which is not only very good for just the general skill level that he has, but also shows that he is an extremely driven player, which is always nice to pick up, especially late in the draft, because those are the types of players who have the highest chance of really being able to outperform their draft position and make it work at the NHL level within the next few years. He saw a massive improvement offensively. He's very comfortable holding the puck, just needs to get a bit better at making the decision making when he's doing so, and he is also an extremely physical player who knows how to use his frame. He's 6'4", no surprises once again for a Mike Grier selection. 6'4", very physical, throws his body around in the junior league, which is always very good. A lot of the times when you get these taller players in the junior leagues, like 6'1", 6'2", they need to be able to grow into their body and actually learn how to use it effectively in a hockey game. But he seems to have already been able to really get acclimated to that and be able to use it very well. So that's definitely a nice thing to see. Like I said, extremely raw, needs multiple years, but could perhaps mean something for the San Jose Sharks. And then finally, their last pick of the draft at 194th overall here in the 7th round is yet another goalie. Might as well take another swing. You never know. As I mentioned, very shallow goaltending prospect pool for the San Jose Sharks. He was also relatively high up on the Sharks goaltending draft board as well. So another player who they were targeting and managed to lock down for themselves. And we shall see if he works out in the future for San Jose. But that would do it for this draft review. A lot of really strong names right at the top with Celebrini and Sam Dickinson. Extremely successful day one. But their day two certainly wasn't bad either. I love the 2nd round picks that they made, and then the 3rd to 7th round picks there that they had as well. Not too bad. We shall see how it works out, but realistically, this was pretty much an A+ draft for Mike Grier. Class dismissed.